I do not encourage any acts of violence or partaking in mosh pits. This video is made for harm reduction, education and entertainment purposes only. Picture this, you walk into a dingy, dark, disgusting basement for your first hardcore show. Once you push past the stench of unwashed armpits and smoke, you enter the more packed section of the crowd. You stand in excitement, the crowd is buzzing. You've listened to hardcore for years and you're finally ready to be surrounded by kind, like-minded people to enjoy the music with. The band comes on stage, feedback and distortion fills the room. Suddenly, you're pushed back and all you see is an empty circle filled with sweaty, overweight degenerates swinging their arms around in the middle. Your heart pulsates with fear as you wonder what to do. Before you're able to do anything, the force of the crowd launches you into the middle. You hear a thud and a ringing in your ears before everything goes black. You awaken outside the venue. What the f was that? What just happened to me? You have just experienced your first mosh pit. And for some reason this has become commonplace at any concert that has any form of energy or aggression. But what is a mosh pit and why on earth is suddenly accepted within the four walls of a stinky concert venue? Moshing, also known as slam dancing or just slamming if you're a weirdo, is an extreme style of dancing which often involves individuals pushing or slamming into each other, although it can take on a variety of different forms. Moshing is primarily performed to more aggressive, extreme forms of music such as metal, punk and more recently hip hop. The mosh pit is the area within the crowd where this dance takes place. Essentially an empty circle is formed in the crowd for these dancers. But how did this happen? How did our society get to a point where this is commonly seen as acceptable? We could go into the origins of dancing as a whole, but that would be incredibly stupid, and of course, this channel is completely serious at all times. The origins of moshing can be traced back to the ska and reggae scene in the 50s and 60s with skanking. Skanking is essentially the running man combined with the performer swinging their fists and elbows left and right as hard as they can. This is the first time in history a specific dance was purposely performed aggressively to match the style of the music at concerts, inspiring elements of modern mosh pits. But of course, ska isn't very aggressive, so something else must be added to the mix to form the modern moshing style. The next step will be pogoing, invented by the punks of the late 70s. Due to the ethos of punk, hundreds of independent DIY bands would come to prominence, resulting in smaller DIY venues and pubs housing these said punk bands. This resulted in overcrowded, overpacked venues with audience members bouncing up and down to see the band playing, in turn creating the pogo. Sid Vicious actually claimed the creation of the dance, citing the performance of the dance as a way to make fun of attendees who weren't real punks, obviously claiming the sole responsibility for the creation of literally jumping up and down can only be done by somebody who's probably taken a little bit too much. So we'll just assume he invented the name or something, I don't know. It wouldn't be until the rise of hardcore punk in the United States that moshing would really come into its own. The early concerts of the likes of Black Flag and Fear would see crowd members jumping and smashing into each other, with members pushing back and forth. This would originally be called mashing, as individuals are essentially just mashing into each other. This was an obvious reaction to the energy and anarchic nature of the bands, with crowds wanting more of an outlet to release their energy. Many bands encourage this behaviour, inciting audience members to mash harder. Although this wasn't an opinion shared by all individuals in the scene. Specifically the band Fugazi opposed to mashing and would consistently politely ask crowd members to stop, as they saw the only way to combat violence in the crowd was with kindness. So we have mashing, but how did it become moshing? Well, it's all thanks to Bad Brains and more importantly Jamaica. HR from Bad Brains would often use the term mash on stage to either hype up or just banter with the crowd. Due to his Jamaican accent, the fans heard the term mash as mosh. This resulted in the term being spelled as mosh in later magazines, eventually becoming the term just used for the dance. This would continue to spread as genres such as thrash metal and grunge would come to the forefront of music culture in the 90s. This meant mosh pits left the dingy dark sports halls that commonly held hardcore shows and were prominent at some of the biggest music festivals in the world. And of course a bigger crowd means much more potential injury, with primarily push pits becoming much larger than the ones seen previously. This cross into the mainstream wasn't without its controversy. The spread of the dance meant the likelihood of increased massively, meaning, much like Fugazi before, many bands were beginning to turn against the style of dance. Specifically Smashing Pumpkins would take a stance against moshing at their concerts after 2 incidents at their shows that resulted in fatalities. Many acts see the dance as a form of bullying nowadays, with larger individuals just using it as an excuse to smack anyone near them. This has resulted in more etiquette, specifically at hardcore shows, where most people within the pit leave people outside the circle alone. I can't say the same for rap shows, although they did discover pits very recently, so maybe give them a few years and a bit of a break. Speaking of hip hop, the introduction of heavy mosh pits in hip hop is something that has only already occurred very recently, with artists like Playboi Carti and Nascar Aloe taking inspiration from the punks previously, in turn encouraging individuals to form mosh pits at their concerts. These will typically be extremely large, with most members not having experience with hardcore mosh pits or hardcore shows before at all, and just assuming the purpose of a mosh pit is to or get. This has meant many shows have led to tragedy, as the size of these crowds is much larger than shows in the past that would have similar styles of moshing. There are various different types of mosh pits, so I think it's time for Push moshing is the most commonly seen form of moshing. Oftentimes, when a song starts, individuals will form a circle in the crowd and stay on the outskirts until the drop. Once the drop commences, all the members will launch themselves into the circle, pushing each other and bouncing about. This is one of the safest forms of moshing, with the main danger being people falling or tripping over, although common etiquette is to stop and pick these people up. A circle pit is a mosh pit in which participants run in circles around the edge of the pit, with the middle often left empty, although occasionally the middle has a creature skanking out to their heart's content. The direction of the circle depends on where you are in the world, as the gravitational pull as well as the position of the moon has effects on the direction of the pit. A wall of death is a mosh pit that sees the audience split down the middle in two halves, often leaving a huge gap in the venue. When the music drops, both halves will run into each other as fast as they can. This form of moshing is said to be invented by the hardcore band Sick of It All, although it was revitalised by Noise Creep in the 90s, and is most commonly seen at metal shows. Venue organisers will often ban the encouragement or organisation of a wall of death by bands. I think the reason for this is pretty obvious. Hardcore dancing is a type of mosh pit that has stemmed directly from the previously mentioned skanking. Essentially, a large circle is opened, with individuals entering the circle just to swing their arms and legs around for literally no reason. This means there are often a lot less people in the pit to avoid multiple concussions. There are many moves that can be utilised within a hardcore pit of this nature, such as windmilling, two-stepping, floor punching, picking up pennies, axe handling, wheelbarrowing, cartwheeling and bucking. You're going to have to guess which of those are made up and which are correct. This is often seen as one of the more safe variations, as only the people in danger are the people who directly choose to enter and swing their arms around. There's also zero risk of any crowd crush. The only real risk is a reduction of brain cells in people who probably didn't need them in the first place. Ninja moshing is relatively similar to other forms, although it's more frowned upon due to the moves used within the pit. Participants often utilise the two kicks they learnt in Taekwondo when they were 6 years old, combining them with a flurry of karate chops and flying fists. Due to the nature of this type of pit, very common, which basically means these karate moves are actually used for their intended purpose. Remember when I said hardcore shows that are often mosh pit heavy have etiquette in order to protect people? Well, forget everything I just said, because this is where I get into crowd killing. Crowd killing is essentially for self-entitled stinky individuals who think brain damage and injuries are a rite of passage for anyone who attends a concert. It essentially involves attempting to injure as many people as possible by swinging closed fists, kicking as hard as possible, and simply just shoving people to the ground. Crowd killers will often target people outside of the mosh pit and occasionally will attempt to crowd kill from one side of the crowd to another. Crowd killing is looked down upon by pretty much everyone and is mainly only performed by the most rancid, heinous individuals you may meet within concerts. And finally, the wildest mosh pit of them all, legitimately something banned in most countries and extremely frowned upon by anyone in the music community, the praise pit, which is a mosh pit that occurs during a Christian church service. Nowadays, mosh pits have extended to pretty much every genre of music, to a ridiculous level at times. The amount of shows I've been to where ADHD kids are trying to form mosh pits to 80 BPM hip hop beats is ridiculous. Recently I literally saw a mosh pit formed to East by Earl Sweatshirt, and if you don't know that song, give it a listen because you'll immediately understand what I mean.